Every once in a while I do a rebuild video on one of these tiny diecast cars. I personally really enjoy doing these as they are quick little projects and are really fun to do. Before I can start the repaint process, I need to strip down the body and remove all of the parts that don't need to be repainted or stripped with the paint stripper. So I just took out a screwdriver, removed the screws from the bottom, and then also took out a metal drill bit in my drill to drill out a couple of the rivets and then carefully remove the parts and pieces that don't need to be resprayed. Now that all of the plastic parts have been removed from the body and we're just left with the metal body itself, I could just put it into a plastic bag, put on a respirator and some gloves, and then start spilling all of the paint stripper on top of it. Now it is very much important to note that this is only suitable for metal. If you were to use this paint stripper on plastic parts, it would completely melt the parts and destroy them permanently. So after letting it soak for a couple of minutes, all the paint is removed, so I put it in the sink to remove any of the excess material and carefully brush it off with an old toothbrush, then dry it off, and I'm ready to move on to the preparation stage. I'm going to be scribing out some of the panel lines to make them a bit deeper and also have the paint not fill them up immediately after the first couple of coats. By the way, the paint stripper was not thrown into the sink, that was put back into the bottle for use on a next project. Once all of the panel lines were scribed out, I started with sanding it down. It has a couple of imperfections and rough sanding marks from the original casting and manufacturing process, so that needs to be smoothed out in order to make it a lot nicer. That was done with a 400 grit. Once that was all completed, I moved on to cleaning it off with a bit of water and some towels and brushes to remove any dust, and applied a couple light coats of Tamiya gray surface primer, which is perfect for metal. A couple coats of primer were applied and I let that sit and cure for a couple of hours before moving on to painting the body in the color. I'm using some Zero Paints Giallo Modena. It's an original Ferrari color. I'm going to start off with some of those hard to reach easy to forget spots and then move on to the rest of the body, applying a couple of light coats, letting it dry in between, and then of course moving on later in the process to give it a nice glossy clear coat. After applying a couple more coats of the yellow and getting a nice coverage all over, I let it cure again for about 30 minutes to move on to the clear coat. I applied 2 light coats of clear and a third bit heavier coat of clear to make it all nice and glossy. After the final coat of clear was applied and I was happy with the finish, I let it sit and cure for about a week before moving on to the next stage. Now, some of the panel lines were a bit too yellow and not really looking all that convincing, so I decided to fill them in with some Tamiya panel line accent color. Now, I decided to go with the black, which was a bit too black. So I carefully started mixing it with some gray just to make it a bit lighter. The black is already in and dried, so I took out a paintbrush and some of the gray panel line accent color and then just carefully brushed it over the one that was already there, which kind of reacts with it and sort of softens it again and mixes it to make it a bit lighter. Now, it's still not perfect, but it is good enough for a first try, and I'm really happy that it does look a little bit better than just having the yellow panel lines. With all of the parts painted in the base coat yellow, I could move on to adding a bit more details specifically to the body and also to the window trim with some black and a brush. Now that all of the body components are pretty much finished, I could move on to starting the interior. Some of the interior parts needed a bit of cleanup as there were a couple of mold lines that could be a bit less, so I just sanded and scribed a couple of those off, primed all the parts, and then started painting them in their base coat colors. With all of the parts painted in their base colors, it was time to move on to adding a couple of details. This was all done with a brush and some Vallejo paints and even some Tamiya paints as well, just carefully going over the parts maybe once or twice to get full coverage, and also a couple of different colors to give it a lot more life and a lot more detail. One of the things that stuck out on the car that I'm replicating is the interior. All of the interior parts that normally are a silver were painted in the same color as the body, a bright yellow. So I first laid down a nice coat of silver just to give it a bright base coat to be on top of, and then applied a couple layers of Tamiya X8 yellow. Now, I could have just painted it at the same time I did the body, which probably would have been better, but I didn't, so I had to do it this way. So now that all of the detailing has been completed, I could move on to assembling it all back together. I'm just using some Bob Smith Industries Super Gold Plus. This is a super glue which dries really quickly, of course, and also is pretty safe for clear parts as it shouldn't haze. So ideal for these small projects where you don't want any hazing and just need a little bit of gluing strength to pull it all together. body and interior are now completed, so the final details were left to do on the wheels. The brake discs themselves did not come with any calipers, so I just put on a small drop of super glue, let that cure, and then painted it yellow to kind of simulate a caliper, which looks a heck of a lot better than no caliper at all. The wheels were also detailed with a bit of silver for all the nuts and bolts, and it could then be put together to finish this one off. With a little bit of touching up on the rear and some black paints, that is pretty much it for this one. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of this build, and maybe give me some inspiration for future builds to come. This video was produced for Tom's Diecast Kits and Collectibles by the Scale Modeling channel.